Okay, I'm Dan Runde. I hold the Schreier Chair, and I'm a Senior Vice President here at CSIS. We are having a conversation about rebooting the innovation economy. RTI is really one of the most important organizations you may or not have heard of. It's a billion-dollar organization with 5,000 employees. They do some of the most interesting research work in the world. And it's been a real privilege to partner with them the last couple of years on a number of publications. This one has just come out, Rebooting the Innovation Agenda, the need for resilient institutions. We're going to be having a conversation today. I think many of the countries that I work in and have worked in, they don't want to just sell rocks, and they don't want to sell agricultural products. They want to get out of the commodity business, and they're interested in science, technology, and innovation. They believe they're trying to achieve innovation-led economic growth. And it's a big part of the challenge of escaping the middle-income country trap. And so what has struck me as part of this work that we've done with RTI, the Research Triangle Institute area, the Research Triangle area was tobacco-based 70 years ago in North Carolina. If you've been down there, it's amazing, the transformation of that economy. That was a tri-sector playbook: education, private sector, government. And that playbook has been taken to other parts of the world to try and achieve the same kind of changes. And it's not so easy, though, to copy-paste. You can't order on Amazon. You can't just order it up on Amazon. It's much more complicated than that. And one of the things we learned as part of the process last year is that the playbook that we've had for the last 70 years is being put under stress. There's a number of disruptors that are coming, and that's why we're calling it the need for resilient institutions. So we went to Silicon Valley, we went to New York, we went to Washington, and asked a series of set of questions and asked different kinds of stakeholders about the changes that are coming to institutions to get ready for this. And that's what this report's about. We also did a 5-part podcast series as part of that I encourage you to listen to. I have a podcast series called Building the Future. We had a 5-part series specifically on this. I'm really pleased that Tim Gable has come up from North Carolina, who's an executive vice president at RTI, and he's going to make some opening remarks. But I just want to say thank you to RTI, and thank you all for coming. I think this is going to be a really important and interesting conversation. Tim, come on up.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
There we go.
Yep.
Extra step.
Yep.
Thank you, Dan, very much. I wanted to start by saying I'm Tim Gable. I'm from RTI International, and really just want to say thank you to Dan and the team here at CSIS. It's been a fabulous collaboration that we've had on this report, and I hope all of you will have a chance to not only read the report, but really enjoy the panel that we've got planned for you today. As Dan said, we're based in North Carolina. I wanted to tell you a little bit about RTI, if you don't mind. We're a nonprofit research institute. Our mission is to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. And so it's an applied research model. We're a soft money kind of place, but our history, as Dan alluded, 60 years ago, I'll take you back, 60 years ago, 1958. This was the year right after Sputnik, and the space race was going on. And if you remember, the story of NASA in 1958 is when President Eisenhower created NASA. And 1958 is also the point in time when the state of North Carolina was facing this challenge, a brain drain problem. We got these great universities of Duke University, North Carolina State University, UNC, but if you didn't work in tobacco or textiles or furniture in the state of North Carolina, there really wasn't a career path for you and you needed to leave. And so the state came together, created the Research Triangle Park region, and at that time, they created RTI, at the time called Research Triangle Institute. So shortly thereafter, in fact, I've got a picture here that I'll ask you to flash up, but shortly thereafter, one of the earliest pieces of work that RTI had was really an innovation-led economic growth program. This group of scientists was funded by NASA shortly after it was created by President Eisenhower to start looking at how to bring space technology into the U.S. economy. And so some of the things that we were involved with over the years, and this goes back to the very founding of the organization, include things like human implantable technology that ultimately now has led to much of the technology for diabetes patients. or some of the mobility technology that you see in wheelchairs and technologies for the handicapped that spawned from lunar rovers and stuff like that. And so the point of that is this notion of innovation and driving innovation into the economy has been part and parcel of what our mission has been since the day we were founded. So if you fast forward to today, here we are 60 years on, and much of the work that you see reflected in this report, we're working around the globe with countries like Malaysia, like Thailand, like Canada, Australia, working with governments, working with the academic sector, working with the commercial industries, to really think about how do you reframe an innovation agenda at a time in this world when things are moving so fast. And how do you marry up the policy side and the academic side and the commercial enterprise? And as I think most of us can appreciate, over the next 5 to 7 years, the changes that are going to come into this world are really going to be shaking things. And so are the foundations strong? Are our institutions resilient to be able to take this? And so I think you'll enjoy the panel today. And again, I just wanted to say how much we appreciated the opportunity to work with CSIS in this work, and hope that you all take from this report the good learnings that we're bringing forward. So thanks.
Okay. Or come on down for that matter, right? So. Come on down. Am I dating myself? Does anyone know about come on down? The Price is Right?
Price is Right.
Right, The Price is Right. It's okay. All right. Well, we've got a really interesting set of panelists, and I want to thank Gary for pinch hitting and joining the panel. Our friend Nate Tibbetts, who is Senior Vice President at Qualcomm, had a family emergency and couldn't make it today. We completely understand that. But we've got really some wonderful people. My friend Sarah Lawrence, who's at RTI and is a person who works at the intersection of business, government, and educators all over the world, both domestically and overseas. And so I'm really glad you're here. I think you're the right person to talk about this. Then my very good friend Magdi Amin, who I've known for a really long time, who's an investment partner who works at the Omidyar Network, who will tell you about that can also make equity investments and can also do philanthropy, and I think is really one of the most interesting it's a social change organization, I think is a way to describe it, but you'll probably have a better way to describe it than that. And then Gary Shapiro, who you're going to hear more about, has just written a book called Ninja Future, and he's the leader of the Consumer Technology Association, which if you've been to CES in Las Vegas, you know that Gary is the parent of CES and as also a friend here of CSIS. Thanks for being here, Gary, and thanks for pinch hitting and joining the panel. I'm very grateful. Thanks.
Well, see if you thank me afterwards.
I know, I will. I promise, I know I will. So, okay, so Sarah, we did this report which basically said, we asked a series of questions. We did some work last year. Your experience on that there is a playbook for change. If you want to have innovation-led economic growth, one of the big takeaways was there are some disruptions. With this report looks at the disruptions and looks at the need for resilient institutions. What were your reactions to what we found in this report?
I think it's a great report. That was the first reaction.
Good answer. That's good. I'll go with that.
I think what's really valuable about the report is we know innovation is important. We know, and countries around the world, states here in the US know that innovation is the way to transform the economy and create jobs, higher paying jobs, which are important. What we learned from speaking to different stakeholders here in DC, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and also in New York, building off when we spoke to folks in Malaysia and in Kenya and in India the prior year, is really learning about what some of the issues are that we aren't hearing in all of the research. Issues around, we want to be the next Silicon Valley, but how do we do that? issues around not just education, but how do you create a workforce that is ready for a lot of these new tech jobs that are coming? How do we start hearing issues around the quality of certifications versus necessarily just a higher education degree. How do you get the business community and the university community to adapt their cultures to accept that certifications might be a viable path to make a lot of the youth populations just more employable. And issues around inclusion that we heard about. We know this is a challenge, but we don't know really what it means. And it does not mean regulation. It does not mean that you have to make everything relevant to everyone, but paying attention to the geographic distribution of innovation and the benefits of how those are concentrated.
Sarah, could you talk about, there's a sense I get that a number of, you must have you must want a dime for every time someone says to you, can I have an RTI, please? They must come to you, they go to the research triangle and say, can I have one of those, please? How do I get that? How do you create the kind of community or the ecosystem that's needed, and where does the change come from? Who's going to lead that change?
Sure. Well, first, for the first 10 years I got that question, I wanted to say, no, you can't, you know that. But now I want to say yes. I want to be controversial.
For
and
a
say,
fee,
yes,
we can do this.
You can copy paste. What my biggest response is that it's investing in the intangibles. It's not investing in the real estate or the laboratories. It's investing in R&D. It's investing in your people. It's investing in your educational institutions. So you're creating this culture and this pipeline, and you're focusing on how you connect people. So it's the networks, it's the connective tissue. It's not just the research labs.
Okay, and so how about, tell a story about El Salvador. So you work all over the world. I was struck, you were just telling the story offline about the conversation about El Salvador, because it seems to me that I think gets to some of what you're describing here.
Right, so we have a lot of people come to the Research Triangle region. I'm sure Silicon Valley has the same. And what was different about a delegation from El Salvador is that we had a delegation from government and from the business community and also from the universities. And it was palpable in the room. You saw everyone sitting in their different sectors, and that they didn't necessarily have a relationship or a strong relationship.
That's diplomatic. It was probably tenser than that.
Probably.
Just saying.
But after 2 weeks of visiting and having learning sessions, you could see every day the stronger communication, and then even just more informal conversations and trust. And then I had the opportunity to work in El Salvador and San Salvador the following year. So to engage with these different stakeholders and see in their board meetings the level of dialogue, coming together, trying to solve these issues, and then to be very concrete about that. For example, the business community and the university community came together and said, we are not training people for IT at all. And it's one of the sectors that does have promise to employ a lot of our younger graduates. And so they went to the government and said, please, we're going to change this curricula. And they were able to do that in 3 to 6 months, whereas typically it would have taken 3 to 6 years. So that's just an immediate result of, again, it's the connective tissue of bringing these different sectors together, not just building out their physical infrastructure.
So it's about getting leaders and change makers together, having some trust, but also getting on the same page of what the problem is, and perhaps having a sense of urgency?
Definitely. A sense of urgency can go a long way. We had that in our Research Triangle region. We were the second poorest per capita income 60 years ago. And we see that in El Salvador. There's, of course, a sense of urgency there. So I think we tend to see more success and traction when the different sectors see that common sense of urgency and want to problem solve to that. And they're willing to make the long-term commitment for it, knowing that innovation and the benefits of that do not, the ROI does not happen in the first year. So when you're measuring these benefits, you need to keep that in mind.
Thanks. Okay, Maggie, thanks for being here. You and I have known each other a long time. We both worked together at the World Bank Group. You were 20 years at the World Bank Group. Almost. You started as a child prodigy. But now you're at the Media Network, and you're working on the issue of digital identity. And so there's a whole digital, there's a whole ecosystem of governments, the private sector, associations, specific kinds of technology, technological regulation, and a whole series of thorny issues that get into that are going to be required to deal with certain kinds of technological innovation. So some things, there's some trade-offs perhaps that we have to deal with. So I'm sure you deal with some pretty thorny issues every day. Talk a little bit about what is digital identity and how does it pertain to this conversation?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dan. And yeah, we've known each other a long time, both World Bank and IFC and the World Bank Group in general, and really appreciate what you've done here and your focus on development, but in a way that also supportive of business in the private sector.
Thank you.
So Omidyar Network is a philanthropic investment fund and a firm that we take a sector view, as Dan was saying. We take a venture capital mindset to solving problems, but we also are concerned with the broader environment and the ecosystem around those problems. And so I work on digital identity, and digital identity is something that we take a broad view of. There is digital identity that governments issue, and when they issue them, they can be done in a way that do empower people to participate. Particularly, there's about 1 billion people around the world that don't have digital identity, and about half of those are in Africa. Africa is rapidly digitizing, but if you don't have the ability to communicate and interrelate with that digital world, you'll be left behind. So we see a big inclusion agenda there. But we're also very aware of the potential downside risks. You know, like a lot of technologies, almost all technologies in a way are dual use. Be used to empower, they can also exclude. There's also risks that emerge, particularly around the privacy of personal data. And you know, we take the view of identity, we take a broader view that includes how each of us interacts with the data economy here in the US in such a way that those firms that we're interacting with can effectively identify us, often for advertising and other purposes. And there needs to be some safeguards. We think those safeguards are important for the sustainability of the industry itself, because we've seen now consumer behavior start to be very clear. All of the survey after survey, talk about very high, high levels of concern with data privacy, both on the commercial side, but also the potential for surveillance at the state level in many countries around the world.
Like China.
Well, I would say that I would be concerned about lots of countries where there's poor institutions or a lack of data privacy, but a lack of respect for basic human rights.
So let's say I'm a Hutu or a Tutsi in Rwanda. Do I want the state to necessarily know if I'm a Hutu or a Tutsi, or use that as sort of an identity?
Absolutely.
Something like that?
Vulnerable communities can be targeted if there aren't safeguards around these technologies and how they're used to identify people. Like we just said, they can be used to empower, but if you're a vulnerable person, you may not necessarily want that information in the wrong hands.
There's also, though, there's an upside to digital identity as well. Like if you want to be able to have access to a bank, or you want to have access to financial services, or you want access to government services. I mean, there's a reason we've had censuses. I don't know if that's the plural of census. Is it censi or censuses? Anyways, we've had censuses since biblical times, because governments need to be able to know, like, how many noses are there, how many kids in school, births, et cetera. So there's a need for. And there are hundreds of millions of people who are, in essence, stateless people, because there's an assumption in the first world, if I can use that term, that everyone's got a birth certificate. We count people when they die. Even in this country, the dead sometimes vote because we don't actually count when someone dies, right? And so this issue of stateless people is a real issue. Or if you're a Rohingya in Bangladesh, you're technically not recognized by the state of, Rohingya in Myanmar. You're not seen as Myanmar, and you're sort of rejected. And so, there's all sorts of terrible things that happen as a result of that. And so having a digital identity, there's a balance between privacy, but also the upside of technology. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely right. And what we want to do, so we're not against the benefits of technology. We emerge from the tech
Can
world.
we do a survey? Who's in pro-tech? Is everyone pro-technology on this panel?
We're pro-tech. Okay, everybody's here is pro-tech. But we want it to be sustainable, and sustainability means to also be clear about what are the externalities or the downside risks that emerge, so as to design in a way that protects for privacy, both privacy by design and, where necessary, regulation around to create those safeguards, so that the tech actually realizes its highest and best use, which is that we can use it to empower ourselves. Yes, access to banks becomes easier at lower cost. KYC, know your customer regulations, become much more easy to fulfill. And when it becomes lower cost, therefore the lower income consumer becomes bankable. So it becomes more inclusive. We can talk about ghost
so we
workers.
can solve those problems with technology.
Absolutely, we can solve ghost worker problems. We can direct benefit transfers and therefore less waste in how, for example, fuel subsidies, which are a huge issue in development, get distributed. So there's lots of upsides. And the World Bank has a very good program, ID for D,
Identity for
Development around this. But we're also very concerned to make sure that when those systems get rolled out, they protect privacy, security, individual empowerment and agency, give people some control over their data.
All right, so you know I like talking about China because I like to think we wear the white hats and some other countries wear the black hats. And so in China, I'm just using this as an example just for this Washington audience, that there's, they've got a whole bunch of stuff I don't think there's any privacy as far as I can tell. Now, you're not saying that's the only, this is sort of the extreme example. I'm using this as an extreme example, and what you're saying, I think you're saying, Magdi, is, Dan, there's lots of other countries other than China where we need to be kind of cognizant of this, and we need to balance privacy and human rights all over the world, and you could even include this country as well in terms of how we balance these issues. But in China, my understanding is, you know, they've got some kind of social scoring system. I was okay when they said I couldn't leave the city, and I was okay when I couldn't travel. It hit a big red line for me when they're like, it impacts your data, your scoring on dating sites. So like the Match.coms of China, you get some kind of, you get like a negative points if you have whatever, like a bad political score, like you don't get swipe left or swipe right or whatever the young people do these days. I'm too old for this stuff, but it seems to me that I thought that was a complete red line. I was like, whoa. So I think this issue of privacy, but at the same time, let me just push on something else, Maggie. So China's sort of an extreme, but this isn't just a China issue. This is a global issue. Yep. But at the same time, getting it right to access these technologies can open up all sorts of services and opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise if we didn't have these technologies, right?
Right.
So, okay, so let me just go, so some people could say, well, even though China doesn't necessarily have the same kind of privacy safeguards, with AI and these other things that are coming, isn't there some kind of upside for them if they've got they get to slice and dice all this data because they you know, in essence, the Chinese government owns all the data? What do we say about that?
So taking the, I haven't studied the Chinese system in great detail.
Yeah.
I do know that there is privacy regulation that is emerging. They have a 2-tier level. They're sensitive information or sort of important information, and then less sensitive information that are treated differently. What I would say is that we in the US, in this audience, and around the world, governments and the private sector need to think about what are the key issues, what are the key public goods, and the key potential harms that we need to mitigate against. And not to have extremely blunt, unfocused regulation that would in fact be a detriment to the innovations that do have such big benefits, but that clearly address those risks. And I think this has to be a global conversation because these are global products. There's not a US ecosystem anymore. And Silicon Valley has become too big not to be confronting this maybe uncomfortable question between investment and regulation. It's just too important now. And these questions have to be addressed sensitively. And I would just have to say that none of this is inevitable. We often see these revolutions as coming in ways that we can't solve for. I think we have to understand that we as consumers, as policymakers, as regulators, as investors, are responsible for creating the world that we want to see.
We can shape it.
We can shape it. And it's a moral question to see what is right, what is ethical that we need to solve for, and address it and make the investments accordingly. With our portfolio, we're investing in companies that are very good for business, that are great solutions, that are also good for privacy and take care of people's data.
All right, so let me just say one more thing, and I want to turn it over to Gary. But we I'm going to use the example of flying cars. So I've seen the Jetsons. Who's seen the Jetsons, right? There's a thing called the Jetsons, the flying cars. So I would argue we have the technology to have flying cars today. Like, why don't we have flying cars today? We don't have flying cars because we've made a series of policy and regulatory decisions. So to Maggie's point, we actually do have the power to shape the future. Policy matters, legal issues matter, regulatory issues matter. That we actually could have flying cars, but we don't. Now, I actually would say I wish we did have flying cars. So I think as we think about some of these revolutions that are coming, some of them may take a much longer time period to kind of kick in. So I mean, driverless cars, and I hope we talk a little bit about driverless cars. So when I think about driverless cars, you probably need 5G, and that's going to take a while. You probably need to guarantee that the North Koreans can't hack the 5G so that all the cars crash into each other at once, right? Yeah. You need some kind of regulatory and thing having to do with lawsuits, right? We lose far too many people with human error on driving cars, driver-full cars as opposed to driverless cars, and we lose far too many people. And there's an implicit social contract that says we accept this very high cost. And I think it's arguable it's a very high cost, and it's too high, but we're going to still lose people. And right now, and so who's going to get sued when someone gets killed in a driverless car accident? Is it Google? Is it Verizon? Is it Qualcomm? Is it the special radar company whose name I don't know? Who is it? General Motors? Who's going to be liable? So that's a thing. I think so. This is going back to the flying cars. This is all the reasons why I don't think we have flying cars, is because of these sorts of issues. So we can actually shape it. Sure. So there are things we can do to shape it, sometimes for good, and I think we have to be careful about stifling innovation. I would argue the fact that we don't have flying cars, I think that's not necessarily a good thing. I wish we had flying cars, right? And I hope we do have driverless cars, but I think we can maybe go too far. And I think maybe the non-existence of driverless cars is an example of us saying we're going to shape the future, perhaps not in a great way. That maybe it'd be great if we had flying cars, just like in Blade Runner, right? We don't have flying cars like in. So Maggie, I agree with you. We can shape it. We have to balance. We have to work together. This is what Sarah's saying. We have to have sort of a rule set. We need to balance there's a series of issues we have to balance. And I would argue in the case of flying cars, we decided that we weren't going to have flying cars. And that's too bad, because we actually have the technology for flying cars, but we don't have them. So as we have these revolutions, we can decide. It is that I would argue that we actually do have the power to decide. And sometimes, but there are implications for that. And I actually hope the United States remains the world-beating leader in technologies. And so I want to make sure we want to do that, but I also want to ensure that poor countries have a chance to participate in the upside of globalization. And that's why I'm so glad Gary's here. I know he's going to talk about his book, but Gary, what do we need to do? You.
I could spend my entire time just rebutting what you've said.
I know. I want you to rebut it. So thanks for being here.
So far, I'm doing really well.
So just would you remind people? So you're at the Consumer Technology Association. Would you just tell people what is CES? Just a slight PSA before you rebut my stuff, because I want you to rebut what I said. But remind people what the Consumer Electronics Show is. How many people go to it?
So the Consumer Technology Association is an NGO, to use your language. We call it a trade association. We're based across the river here in Arlington, Crystal City, home of Amazon's new headquarters. And we have 2,000 American companies that are our members, 2,000 plus. We also own and produce events around the world. We produce the world's largest business event, the largest innovation event, the largest trade shows, the CES, held each January in Las Vegas. Tracks about 180,000 business people, including about 60,000 people from outside the US, 4,500 different exhibitors, 7,000 press. It's known by, according to a recent survey, 45% of the American public knows what it is. We also have an event in Shanghai we've had for 5 years. It'll be in June. And we have events in Paris and in Amsterdam and sometimes other places around the world. But we're a trade association, so we do things you'd expect us to do. We do lobbying. We count the widgets. We project the numbers of widget sales. We do all sorts of things. Create standards. We helped create the HDTV standards. We did the RS-232, the back of the computer. We're doing a lot of it in the drone area. And in self-driving cars, we actually have a pretty active ecosystem of companies helping us get there. Now, I want to respond to so many different things you said. I just don't know where to begin, but I'll start with, when you talk about that we could do flying cars, we can't. There were some companies showing things like Bell Helicopter at CES in just January. And it's starting, but the drone technology's come along. One of the things that's helped it come along is the concept of 3D printing, actually. It allowed Bell to get their prototype in 6 months, where it usually takes several years. So how you could get something from the idea stage to the market has increased just rapidly in the last few years because of advances in 3D printing and lower costs. So that's changing the whole nature of getting your ideas to market. If we talk about self-driving cars, we're already there, frankly. I've been in so many. I went a mile in San Francisco. There's a driver ready to take over. He never had to. He kept up with the trout. The car did fine. Google stopped their self-driving car experiment with Waymo, where they were letting their employees take the cars to work, to home rather, and then go to work in them. Because they have a camera in the car, and they noticed that the employees were falling asleep, playing video games, texting. They were supposedly watching the road. It was working. It works really well. You've heard about 2 highly publicized deaths. There will be deaths with self-driving cars. They're not perfect, especially in the beginning. But we have 35,000 accidents a year that kill people in the US, 1 million worldwide, hundreds of thousands of people. Everyone in this room has clearly been affected by people you know and love, and you've lost them. And there's a way out. We don't have to do that in the future. And with over 90% or 95%, depending on your estimate, of these collisions being caused by human error, there's possibilities there. But they're interesting. I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but the bottom line of it is, so we do market projections of sales. I was trying to figure out in December, I had my meeting with my market research team, and we're talking about how we were readjusting 2018, projecting 2019. And we were $1 billion off on car technology products. And I asked why. And the answer was that when people are buying new cars today, they're buying everything having to do with collision avoidance. So there's passive collision avoidance, where your car will vibrate or do something to you or move the wheel if you're going out of your lines. And there's active collision avoidance, which I actually have, which actually the car in front of you stops. If you're about to hit it, the car will stop. People are buying this. Americans are buying it. We are getting there very, very quickly. I mean, every issue you mentioned is surmountable. The legal things, that's just a question of working the legal issues out. I mean, we've confronted that with every new technology since the invention of lawyers. They'll fight over it. Lawyers have killed the legislation in the Senate, sadly, last year after it passed the House.
It's on driverless cars.
On self-driving cars. But we are at self-driving now. We do have active collision avoidance. It's just a question of what level, how much we're going to get there. There's a law now in some states and federally built around the fact that you have to have a steering wheel. You could take the steering wheel and all that stuff with the driver out, save a ton of money on the car, save a lot of the cost, the weight. It'll be not perfectly safe, very close to safe. You'll empower disabled people and elderly people, and it will change in so many ways. A lot of new businesses will be created around it, certainly. You'll be talking about people helping people with groceries, getting things from the car to the home. You still have people who have to be with kids. What happens if someone gets sick or dies in the car? There's they have to be cleaned, they have to be maintained. But imagine if you could get, as the CEO of Ford spoke at our show recently, envision a future where you have self-driving cars, how that'll change the nature of cities, the way Uber and Lyft today have changed where kids live. And if you want to talk about what's changed, it used to be for us growing up, and I'll put you in my age category.
Put me in my, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
The driver's license in the car was our definition of coming of age,
exactly.
of independence. It's no longer the case. The phone is today. That's what frees you up to the world. Kids aren't getting driver's licenses. They're not learning how to drive. Statistically, the car sales are going down among youth. And it's just not a matter of maybe some of it is they don't have the money that we had or whatever, but they don't need them anymore. And they're not necessary. And it's a distraction. And we will free up work for ourselves if we could.
Gary,
so I could spend a lot of time with self-driving, but what was your
one of the points.
So all the things you mentioned as barriers, they're all overcome.
Manageable.
There are other, we have a collision repair business which is going to go away. Think about that. The auto insurance, to their credit, are figuring out the existing auto industry, I'll give them credit. They have seen the future, and every one of them is focused on self-driving. The Europeans a little bit less so, frankly, than the Americans and the Japanese and the Chinese, but they're all there. Some may think we may never get there totally. There will be those, and I sat with one on a plane, a member of Congress on a plane last week, who said, basically, he agreed with me on everything. It was great until we were landing, and then he said, self-driving, never, car race, I will never, ever get in a car where I'm not in control of the steering wheel.
Gary, I want to get to some other things, but I love what you were saying in the pregame lunch about.
Oh, that's what you want me to say.
I do. I want to talk about who stopped the bill on self-driving cars and
so
why.
in the Senate, it died for two reasons. The truck drivers got themselves taken out of the Senate bill, even though they're in the House, and they lobbied, even though there's like several 100,000 truck driver jobs open today if anyone's looking for a job. They're there. I mean, I know in Virginia there's a 2.8%
we can't
employment
fill.
rate.
There's several 100,000 jobs we cannot fill on a truck driver.
And the trial lawyers put the death knell to it. They just wouldn't let it go to the Senate floor. And
You described it as there will be an NRA of car drivers.
Yes, and there will be, because there are people who are passionate about their cars. But you know what? We've done a lot of research demographically. It depends who you talk to and what question you ask. If you ask older people, will they give up their car? Most people say no, except if they're really old and then they see the benefit that it empowers them because they could get around. Younger people they don't care about cars. And if you ask the question to anybody, do you want to pay lower insurance premiums? Because of course you will. Do you want to deal with aggressive and drunk drivers and have them,
terrible.
So you ask the questions the right way, people love this. And once they get in one and they see that it works, and it's like, look, this is a bad day to raise this issue. The truth is, airplanes today are pretty much driven by artificial intelligence. And phenomenal until a few months ago and this week, a phenomenal safety record, phenomenal. I mean, the number
how many
of
flights are there a year?
Yeah,
5
and
million,
even with
3
these
million?
questionable planes at this point, the ratio is extraordinarily. You're definitely more likely to die in a car accident per mile driven than a plane by a factor of like 1,000. So that's in terms of in terms of what I'd like to talk about and some of the other things is that's just one technology, self-driving cars. It's an application of something called artificial intelligence, which is really very big. And there's issues of blockchain. Can I ask another panelist a question?
Yes.
So when you're focused on ID and things like that in developing countries, do you look at blockchain and look at it as a use case? And also, do you look at private property ownership and how, if you could have private property ownership, how that correlates with economic development?
Yeah. So the report was quite interesting in that it sort of mapped out institutions that over time were important to making economic development more sustainable. And private property rights is a key institution. It sort of democratizes the ability for us to trade, own, develop land, and invest in them. Today, the property rights need to be different, and we're not there yet. And about what are the rights around data? We have different metaphors for data. But to go back to your question, give me back your question.
Private property.
Yeah. Private property is something that we can if you have digital identity, you can link that to private property and make it more tradable. I think your question was on blockchain. Yeah. So, we invest in blockchain where it makes sense, where the use case warrants it. A lot of people look at blockchain as a solution to a lot of things. It not necessarily should be. It's not the easiest solution, and it's therefore not the appropriate solution sometimes. But we have an investment in a company called Learning Machine, which uses blockchain to give you control over your ability to manage your certifications, like your education credentials. They're called block certs. Extremely powerful, creates a lot of efficiency, taking middlemen out. So we believe in blockchain. We believe it's sometimes overly prescribed in terms of use cases that doesn't need to be in. But we're sort of agnostic. If it works, we'll use it. If it doesn't work, we don't need it.
Can I ask you all about one of the things that I think comes up is the issue of changes of skills and human resource development in this changing world. Right. If we're going to get out of driving cars, in every instance of a technological revolution, it's true that there are new jobs created. But it seems to me there's certain new kinds of skills and you need new kinds of skills to change with the times. Can I start with you, Sarah, in terms of how are you seeing educational institutions think about sort of the changes that are coming?
I'm not going to answer that exactly.
So it's okay.
But I want to get back to the point of, I do think we can manage that and we can create our futures. And I think a great example.
You're buying that. You're buying we can shape it.
Totally buying
Okay.
it. Maybe not, we can't control everything, but
Okay.
part of it. And because I want to bring up the example of, to me this is disruption of industries and the examples of how Pittsburgh
Yes.
dealt with the manufacturing sector and all of the job losses there in the 80s versus Detroit.
Right.
And Detroit was later as a community in terms of investing in new sectors that would create the jobs. Pittsburgh has the highest per capita philanthropic giving, I believe, than any other city in the US. And the foundations came together and saw that the sector, manufacturing steel, was declining and the massive disruption it was going to cause for residents there, workers there, and invested in new sectors, invested in tech, invested in linking Carnegie Mellon and UPitt into building out incubators in biomedical sectors. And Pittsburgh now is one of these rising stars with self-driving cars. I took my first one there to a U2 concert, I believe. And so I think that gets back to managing the transition. And I think that gets back to linking all of these disruptions, creating the space for technologies to take place. But how do we look at places that are going to be disrupted, look at the workers and those who are going to be losing their jobs, and make sure that you're creating openings in new sectors and training for jobs in those sectors?
So what did Pittsburgh do different than Detroit? Was it about city government leadership? Was it university leadership? Was it philanthropy leadership, or all of the above?
I think it was about seeing the future, owning the disruption, and investing in emerging sectors that could create those jobs. So it was then all of the above. I think it gets back to the sense of urgency in a place. I think Pittsburgh is also a smaller community, so you have stronger networks where there's stronger communication and connective tissue across the board. And so there were more synergies to create these investments. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, right? Are there plenty of displaced workers? I am confident that there are. But I think Pittsburgh is a tremendous success story, and it took also 30 years. For, I believe, a couple of years ago was the first year Pittsburgh did not have population loss.
I thought it correlated with the strength of the football team.
With the football team. Okay, but what was the role of education institutions in that?
I think Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh played investments in the robotics. I mean, the robotics sector at Carnegie Mellon, the group of professors there were actually hired by Uber. I'm digressing a little bit. Uber went and hired them, put a big billboard outside of the university, paid them, double or something, and said, "Come work with us." But let me answer your question. They invested in the whole ecosystem. So they invested in the universities. I think they then created these technology incubators and accelerators. They invested in R&D. They invested in startup and support services to bring the R&D out of the universities into companies and into businesses that are now a whole new industry sector that are employing people and attracting young people there because it's affordable.
Gary and Magdi, can I bring you into this on the role of education and higher education? How do they play into this conversation about resiliency and change to make innovation-led economic growth happen? Magdi?
It's a great set of questions, and I think we would all agree around the world that there's enough work, there are enough jobs being created, there are enough unsolved problems to absorb the labor. The problems are a couple. Okay? One is the business model of actually funding those solutions. And philanthropy can play a key role in some environments. Some environments it might need to be the public sector, and some environments it might be elsewhere. But where we see a problem, I worked in Africa and the Middle East for a long time, the public institutions were just not flexible enough to absorb the market signals and to develop the pipeline of skills needed to support the industries that were growing. And things were moving too quickly for the public sector to react. So that institutions need to be more nimble and more innovative and more responsive to signals. And once that happened, then that employment engines can start to create. And of course, it has to be lifelong. I mean, because a lot of people do have skills, but are educated in things that are not as needed now, but can very well be, there could be adjacent sectors that can be redeployed. So
less art history and more engineering?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Tunisia, you had a huge number. The highest unemployment was in college graduates, that led to the Arab Spring. You see that in Morocco and some elsewhere. So technical and vocational training, that concept needs to be expanded, but also in some way kind of rethought, not just as an alternative to college, but that everybody needs to be continuously reinvesting in skills and delivered differently to be relevant in today's market.
Gary, what do you think about this education question? Then I want to give Sarah a chance because I suspect you may have a view. Yes, Gary, on higher education.
I do. I will respond to that, but first I have to answer Sarah because she never finished the Detroit equation.
Oh, yeah.
Given my close connections to Detroit, like I'm there every week, Detroit actually is a success story. It's just not a well-publicized one. They did have the implosion of the U.S. auto industry, at least the U.S. unionized auto industry, and they suffered from it. But this guy named Dan Gilbert, who owns, ironically, the Cleveland Cavaliers, lives there, and has a mortgage company which has done phenomenally well, and he's built 100 or so businesses. He bought 100 buildings in Detroit. Detroit suffered from a migration of people, over 1 million people. It's the largest physical city in the country with its landmass. So it's tough to get an apartment or a rental place in large portions of Detroit because it's so hot among young people. It's had a total turnaround.
Really?
And the unemployment there rate is very, very low, and there's a lot of, and it's just not Dan, there's a lot of cohesiveness, racially diverse cohesiveness actually in the city. It's very positive. So it's a phenomenal success story. You just hear about the bankruptcy, but the turnaround is amazing. There's incredibly beautiful buildings that people are redoing. It's just the parties, the tech sector there, it's just huge. So about education, obviously one of the strengths of the United States at least is the university community. It's a big one. And there is, I think, a strong sense that communities will do better if the educational system, especially at the upper level, coordinates. This morning I was at the Northern Virginia Technology Council board meeting, which is 60 CEOs, and the governor was there. And also the university presidents from Virginia are there, almost every meeting. And it's a consolidating unit saying, we're going to focus, we're going to promote and sell to Amazon, we're going to do all these things, we're going to produce this stream of people. We need these type of kids educated in these different areas. This is how we'll produce them. But we also realize that we could double the output of the universities in Virginia, and we're still not going to have enough of what we need. We need more. And we need immigrants, and we're not getting them, especially highly educated ones we're not getting. I mean, we get them when we kick them out. We've had a fall off in university applications from outside the United States. Honestly,
because they're not feeling
you just can't blame Trump since September 11th. So it's just gone down in terms of applications. They don't feel safe. They don't feel welcome, and they especially don't feel welcome lately. And then we have a birth rate that's the lowest now in our lifetimes.
In the United States.
And we're living longer. Yeah, and I'm talking about the U.S. Now, I do go around the world and I hear, how can we replicate Silicon Valley? And that's to me, like, you have to get over that question because we have Research Triangle. We have other great places. We have great places, and I love what Steve Case has done. I was part of his tour for a little bit where, there's a lot of great places in the United States, but there's a lot of great places around the world where there's innovation. And what it is to me, and I was talking earlier, we've actually ranked countries in the world and we rank states with a separate scorecard of how innovation friendly they are. We have created our own criteria. There are criteria, you could disagree. They're based on third-party sources for the most part, but there's some subjectivity on our part. For the states, we look at tax policy, labor policy, friendliness to new business models like drones and self-driving cars and Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. We look at other things that matter, we think. And then when we do the global one, we use slightly different rankings because we have, in the United States, common law is a common constitution. Other countries don't have the same liberty that we have. We think that's very important. Not only the right freedom of religion, but freedom to choose your political parties and vote for someone in a meaningful way. Freedom to access the internet. Freedom to marry who you want. Liberty is important. Clean air and clean water is important. We put it in there because we're really good at the U.S. It's a well-kept secret, but we're one of the cleanest air and water in the world at this point. And then there's other criteria like broadband speed and choice. There's diversity we think is very important. We were talking about earlier, it's a challenge to measure, but we want it in there as a criteria, and we'll come up with better ways to measure it. And other things. And you could go on our website and you could see any of these. And we have only done, like, I think 60 countries at this point or so, because we need more data, and some of the data just isn't there. But we're continuing to look at how we can expand that because we believe that every country has the potential, and every country wants it. Yep. And that's important because the will is there. And the diversity thing is really important. That's a real hidden American strength that we don't usually talk about. because I've been to Asia. I used to say Asia and paint it with one brush. I know that's wrong because the Chinese have proven to be very innovative. But in homogeneous cultures like most Asian countries, there's a lot of agreement. In Japan, there's not even a word for no. So they make decisions together that they're very pleasing to the group, but not very good sometimes. And there's a lack of creativity. We used to say the Chinese aren't creative or innovative. They sure are. I mean, you have 1,000 people working on the same thing, and maybe a copy of an American internet system, but they'll make it better. There's no question that WeChat, which is the Chinese system for almost everything, is much better than what we have. We do crazy things like we try to make things illegal, like in, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, first city in the country to ban and actually to require that if you go into a restaurant or a retail store, you must have the right to pay cash. They're trying to get rid of these electronic systems. Now in China, it's welcome to do that. In the US, the message that Philadelphia is sending is we don't like innovation. Now it's all well-intentioned. We're trying to protect poor people. Never mind that poor people, there's Lordy laws that say that the way poor people are paid has to be accepted. This goes way beyond that. So by forcing your businesses to have to accept care, you're imposing costs, you're creating fraud, and frankly, you're depriving the government coffers of a lot of money. Because one thing government employees do not realize is the cash economy is huge in the United States. And forget all the disparity of wealth numbers and all that. We are not counting the right statistics here. There are total cultures that are a lot of immigrants are based on the cash economy. So you're encouraging a cash economy, you're encouraging bad measurements, lack of tax revenue, and a lot of things, and a lack of innovation.
All right, we got to get to some questions. So I want to see some hands here. I'm happy to call on folks otherwise. Okay, so this gentleman here, my friend Tony Carroll, and this woman here, okay?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for putting this on. This is a very important subject.
Name, rank, and serial number.
Okay. Eagles Milbergs. I was the Economic Development Director for Washington State from 2008 to 2013. From the nadir of the recession recovery, Washington State's doing great, Seattle's doing great. My question revolves around how healthy our innovation ecosystem is, how competitive it is. A couple of quick points. One, 25 years ago, 95% of the venture capital activity in the world was going on in the U.S. Today it's below half, about 50%. If you look at the infrastructure around the world that's going in, we're way behind on a whole pile of variables here. It looks like other nations are out of the starting blocks faster than we are. We are a net importer of advanced technology, not an exporter, which we used to be. So the question I have is, one, are there lessons that we can learn from other nations that we could adopt here? Is our high-tech sector at risk? Is this a Sputnik moment that we really have to double down and figure out our future when it comes to innovation?
Great, thank you. This woman here. Nicholas, give this woman the microphone, please.
You have to answer the question first.
No, we're gonna bunch the questions. Go ahead. Okay. Name,
Yes.
rank, and serial number.
My name is Karen St. John. I'm retired from BP. My question is around the role of corporate leadership, particularly in trying to sustain these ecosystems that are going to be innovative and productive. You know, we just had this whole, we're still having the debate about Amazon and how much it should be giving back. You've got Silicon Valley, which is referred to as a model, but yet we're having arguments today about what are the roles of some of these companies in terms of the community. And so I'd be interested in any of your views on that.
Okay. Tony Carroll.
Hi, Tony Carroll. I'm a former senior associate here. I teach at Johns Hopkins, and I have a consulting firm. I think if we're looking at a reasonably static demographic, you mentioned population growth in the United States, it's one thing to try to maybe shift the focus to create new opportunities and new reskilling. But one of the things that I confront in this area is I do most of my work in Africa, and I'll be speaking on this next week in a conference in Johannesburg. What about confronting the demographic bulge that Africa now has and will have for the next 30 or 40 years in terms of how we're going to create employment opportunities when we're seeing growth rates that are just absolutely unprecedented in human history. So I'm worrying about, that's great, we can create new opportunities in this country, changing some of the population from doing one thing to the next. But when you've got this massive growth of population, young people, it's going to create an environment of instability, and they're going to have to be employed in some way. And just as a note, I would recommend that you take a look at a recent paper by Jack Goldstone, a leading demographer, on the impact of Africa's population growth.
Great. Okay, so one of the disruptions that we often don't talk about is the demographic disruption. Some is global aging. We've talked a little bit, referenced that here in the U.S., but also the massive youth bulge. They're both of these disruptions happening at the same time. And we looked at this. We did a report, and Aaron Williams, one of the 4 co-chairs of this report, we looked at in terms of the future of work. And certainly much of the attention on the future of work has been around technological disruption, but I would argue that demographic disruption is as big in many countries or even bigger than technological disruption, or you could argue that. So there have been 3 really interesting questions put on the table. I'll let our panelists just respond to any as however they want to do so. Sarah, I'll start with you.
I will start with the last question. I don't know, and I don't think we know. What I do think is promising, especially as we're talking about this through the tech lens, are organizations like Andela, who are, I believe they're located in West Africa. I don't know.
In Nigeria.
Are they in Nigeria?
Or started in Nigeria.
What
They
is
started
Andela?
in Nigeria. And you might be able to better describe their...
we're an investor in Andela. They create world-class developer talent in Africa because the number of jobs needed that are world-class developers far outstrips the education system's ability to do it. So they're a private entity that's creating these developers, and they can work for anybody in the world. They can work for Amazon in Crystal City.
Right, which gets to your corporate question a little bit, because I don't know who some of the founding corporations were of Andela, but I believe they started it through sort of corporate philanthropy at first. Maybe not.
Yeah, they were VC initially, but yeah, they've got a lot of philanthropy, and most recently, I believe the biggest VC was Al Gore's unit just put $100 million into them.
And so they link these recently trained students with first internships with companies. A lot of them are based in the US, IT sector companies. And then it's almost a trial period. And then these individuals are employed or in some fashion. I don't know if, to what degree it's full employment or not, but it provides jobs. Is it going to solve the youth bulge problem? I don't pretend to say that, but I think there's really interesting models out there that need to be scaled and tested so that we're not avoiding that and just, I'm not saying you're avoiding it, but I think we're all concerned about it, and I don't think we have great scalable solutions to address that issue.
Do you want to comment on the question about the health of our innovation ecosystem? I suspect you have a view on that, Sarah.
Sure. I think it varies depending on the state. I think a lot of innovation ecosystems vary by state, by their regulations and what they invest in. I think the states that are doing the best are the ones that have committed investment to R&D. And also state-driven venture funds. So Utah, for example, which is Silicon... Which one is it? It's Nairobi is Silicon Savannah, and Silicon Slopes is Utah. Everybody's got a different silicon. But I think there's a lot of states who are doing some interesting things that, of course, aren't California. And I think they're the ones that have those. They're state-run. Now, they outsource the operations of the VC fund, but they recognize there is a role of the state in terms of investing in innovation, which has always been the case in the U.S. I think. What's most alarming to me in the U.S. is our decrease in funds and R&D overall with some of our federal agencies when you compare that to the 50s and 60s. And I think that fueled a lot of the innovations that made Silicon Valley happen. I think part of that story is left off. And I think we're not committing to that longer term play in technology development. So I think that's concerning compared to other countries that are playing that long game.
Magdi?
Yeah, so the innovation ecosystem is thriving, but I agree with you, there's some concerns. I think a lot of VC money now is concentrating into very, very large, big investments, trying to seek the next unicorn. We want to make sure that enough early and seed stage funding is there, A and B rounds. For smaller companies that are really, the long term, that's the drivers of innovation. So big, concentrated, large sources of capital, but is it getting distributed well? Corporate leadership matters. Carolyn from BP. I think people are recognizing that there's social license to operate, that the long-term resilience and sustainability that's needed for this innovation engine to continue depends on people making good ethical choices. Bad products that have harms that are unchecked, they don't need only regulation to check them. They need leadership to check them. People to take responsibility for the harms for their products and put out good products that are good for people and make money. And so on the youth bulge, I think technology is undoubtedly part of the solution. Maybe there's some issues that people talk about whether manufacturing is, and the ladder that it used to be for countries, maybe that's changed. But I still see, for example, what we talked about in digital identity, getting more people access to participate in the real economy because they're bankable or they have the ability to engage, or safety nets reach them so they get back into the workforce if they're on, or they could generate some money to start a business. All of those create economic dynamism and reduce waste and reduce corruption. In the end, that bigger pool, that bigger dynamic economy is what's needed. And it's also about the quality of that work, right? And it doesn't all have to be tech, although great if it is, but tourism, higher value agriculture, construction, all of these can be facilitated by more dynamism, and I think tech is definitely part of the solution, as long as we make sure that the safeguards are in place.
Okay. Gary, let me just give you just a brief response to anything you heard here, because I want to move to your making some larger remarks from the podium.
Yeah, I love the innovation infrastructure question, but I want to answer the leadership question because I think we have a failure of leadership in our country. For me, the defining moment was just recently during the federal government shutdown when you had the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House basically agree to go to their bases and throw out the government workforce, basically, overboard for a couple of months, essentially taking 2 months of progress out of our country just so they could go to their base and define the issue that defines the difference between the two parties at this point. And it was, and that was my point when I said I have to stand up and do something, and I personally did. I mean, we not only fed some government workers, but we were ready to go with an ad in the Washington Post signed on by 40 major association leaders like myself and labor unions saying, we're better than this. And there's a failure of leadership in this country, and I think there's a growing sense of the corporate community, whether it be on individual rights, like who you can marry and things like that, or even how our country is run, that it's not being done right. These two warring political parties are irrelevant, in a sense, to what we're trying to do as a country. And we're doing pretty well as a country despite them. So, Washington focuses on things which are relevant to most people and has their battles, and it may get great television ratings, which is part of the problem, but it doesn't go to the world our kids will inherit from us. And I think that's a serious problem.
All right. So on that note, I'm going to ask Gary. You've got
the Democrats and the Republicans.
Gary's just written a book that he's promised to sign free copies of if you stick around till the end. So you got to stick around. But Gary, you're the president and CEO of the Consumer Technology Association. You've written 3 books. Your new book is called Ninja Future, which I'm 2/3 of the way through, and I did buy retail. And it's about this issue of innovation and how we make innovation happen and what's it take for countries to, and you looked at it from a global standpoint, not just from a U.S. standpoint, so we thought it was appropriate that you make some remarks. And so I'm hoping folks will stick around to hear Gary, but also to get copies of his book. I'm really enjoying his book. Gary, come on up here. Okay, thanks. All right.
Thank you for that introduction. Of all the introductions I've ever received in my career, that was without question the most recent. So you've heard a little bit of my viewpoint, but I want to tell you about Ninja future. So I've been writing about innovation and talking about it for over a dozen years now, and it stems from our viewpoint as an organization. So I'm a corporate employee, so that's what I am. I'm a corporate leader. But it really stems from a meeting we had. There was a defining moment for our board over a dozen years ago where someone interrupted and said, forget the agenda. How are we going to be doing in 10 or 15 years as an industry, the consumer technology industry? And it was amazing to me is how brief the conversation was. Everyone around the table said that we will not be doing well because the economy of the United States would be faltering because we were not paying attention to our own economic health. And we weren't focusing on what mattered. And we were giving our kids and our grandkids a debt they will never be able to pay because we as a generation are taking things for ourselves and promising ourselves benefits which are unpayable. So we said, well, what can we do about that? When you have a national debt as large as ours, and then it was under 10 trillion, and now it's over 21 trillion. Well, you could do one of three things. You could raise taxes, you could cut spending, or you could have economic growth. So we decided we would go and support any solution that a bipartisan group came up with, which said that of raising taxes and cutting spending. We're not your typical group that just says cut taxes. We're willing to raise taxes. We even supported the bipartisan commission that Obama supported results, which said basically you use a consumption tax, which is like, for us, it's like death, but we were willing to support that because it was bipartisan and would go towards reducing the deficit. In terms of cutting spending, we have plenty of ideas. We're especially talking now about healthcare costs and using technology as an alternative to drugs, given that the drug industry charges U.S. consumers much more than anyone else in the world and tries to justify it. You could watch their ads if you want on television about how they make it sound like cutting drug prices is un-American and Americans should be paying more than anyone else in the world. It's kind of weird. But we don't talk that much about it. Our focus has been on growth. So we said we're going to focus on growth because a growing economy does actually, you save a lot of money, more people are paying taxes, there's less people on the public welfare or dole or recipients, and it's healthier for everyone because work is good. Work gives you a sense of purpose, which is really something I'll get into in a minute. So we said, how can we grow the economy? Well, growth comes from innovation. And innovation is what we should be talking about as a national strategy and who we are and what we do. And how do you get innovation? And what is innovation? Innovation has been defined as creating value of something that's not been produced before. When I've been corrected in that because governments can innovate. I've talked to various government agencies in this town about how they do innovate and where their focus on innovation. It's just not producing something people pay for, it's providing greater efficiency. It could be like what Starbucks does, which produces ambience and an atmosphere. It could be a quicker, better way of doing things. And the United States has actually had a very, very good run with innovation, certainly in Seattle, and other parts of Silicon Valley and elsewhere around the country. But why is that? We have to ask ourselves. And in looking at it, to me, it's a combination of a bunch of lucky circumstances that for those of us in the room that are American, I know a lot of you are not. I apologize for being eccentric, but I have talked about around the rest of the world about some of these same principles. And then, first of all, we have a culture of innovation here. It is a culture, one of a few, maybe Canada and Israel, the other two, where it's okay to fail. And you could be viewed as learning something rather than a failure in life. So when our kids fail or when businesses fail, when someone starts off, when I'm hiring people, the fact that they've failed at something, what have they learned? And we always learn from failure. We don't usually learn from success. Success teaches us that we think we're greater than we really are and we're smarter. Sometimes you're just lucky, and that's a fact. So failure to me is the great learner. We also have a Constitution, Bill of Rights, a First Amendment that allows all these great things for us. It allows us to have dissent. It allows us to disagree with each other. We have a culture of immigration here. Most of us descend from immigrants, most of whom came here voluntarily, and for a better life. So all of us, in one way or another, seem to come from people that thought there was a better way of doing things. So that mix has been a wonderful mix in the United States, and our diversity, being so diverse. And as I said earlier, you go to some places in the world, Asian cultures, especially I'd say Japan, where everyone agrees with everyone. There's no word for no. It's something that everyone agreeing does not produce it. We're very good at disagreeing. The other thing is we're a very young country. We're only a couple hundred years old. And in a way, that's difficult. So we disagree on issues that most other countries have long since resolved, most social issues like abortion and marriage and different religions and things like that. If you all have one religion and one culture and one set of values, you don't have these battles we have with each other that are so divisive on certain things. Other countries have passed it, but we disagree a lot as a nation. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm not saying it's all good, but it is what we have as a nation. So that focus on innovation, what else does it take? Well, we're pretty much blessed to have one language for the most part, English, that we've accepted, and we have a great university system all the way up. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about our educational system. If you want to really get discouraged, talk about to some of the younger people in your organizations and talk to them about their student loans. Not only why they took them out, but even ask them if they know the interest rate they're paying and what they're doing. It's kind of shocking, actually, to me. There's a lack of financial literacy in our country, and I would say our educational system does need an overhaul, but I don't lose sleep over the fact that we're not great at rote learning for science and some other things, or even spelling. But there is, when you compare our national scores compared to others, we don't do as well, especially compared to other developed countries. But that's okay because we're much more creative, I think. And if you look at what we export creativity. It's not only Hollywood and music, it's video games. It's our technology like what Apple has. It's our chip companies. It's our drug companies. We are creating things, and we're good at it. Now, does that produce a lot of manufacturing jobs here? No. But I've been in factories all over the world, and it's not that they're necessarily deplorable. Some of them were, increasingly less. It's just that a lot of the jobs are still very repetitive and rote, and anyone with a high school degree is going to struggle with that. So we have a very highly educated population, which would not be happy at those jobs. So if you accept the fact that we are an innovative country, the question is, how do we keep it? We're not investing in physical infrastructure. We're not even investing very well in broadband structure. I mean, we debate things that are really, to me, less relevant, like net neutrality, rather than debating how do we get many different broadband providers to compete with each other and produce the competition we need. That's one of the reasons I'm excited about 5G. I'm excited about Wi-Fi as a escape valve. I mean, I love what the cable industry did. They knew they were going under. They had a strategy. They said, we're going to be broadband providers rather than just one-tube entertainment providers, and they created the technology to do that. So different industries have strategies. Our nation should have a strategy, and the strategy should be built around education and our unique skills. This is the way I tell every community in the world, don't build yourself around Silicon Valley. Build yourself around what your strengths are and where you can achieve and go to, and focus on those. And that's what we have to do, and I think we're doing it for the most part, but we're doing it with a lack of national leadership. And I was telling people earlier, I don't lose sleep in my job so much about our national leadership doing the right thing. I worry about them doing the wrong thing. If they don't do anything, I think we'll be okay for the most part. But I worry about, because I've had a career that's focused on preserving innovation at every level, starting out as a student, actually, in Georgetown here, preserving the legality of the VCR, to talking about home recording generally, to focusing on the internet and how we could commercially exploit that, to going along further with HD TV and having the best global standard in the world, to creating a goal and going for that goal. And that's the job of leadership, when I see leadership. You create the big goal. You don't say how you're going to get there. You rely upon a community of well-meaning people from government, from the private sector, from consumer groups and others, to get together to achieve a worthwhile goal. I mean, it's tried to talk about the man on the moon Kennedy goal, but we haven't had one of those since then. And we could have one with self-driving cars that say we want to eliminate a certain number of deaths by a certain date. We could do it in other ways for other products. When I think about some of the things come along, the technology tools, I was listening to National Public Radio this morning, and I heard Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who invented the World Wide Web, celebrating his 30th year, and he was lamenting what he'd created. And I was at dinner with him last week. He was doing the same thing. It was off the record, but since he said it on NPR, I'll tell you what I said to him was, you know what, you're beating yourself up for something you created. You know, when man invented fire, well, he didn't invent fire, man harnessed fire, discovered fire, a zillion years ago, it was a great thing. You could survive a winter. You could eat food that you wouldn't otherwise be able to eat. But fire was also used as a weapon. Every technology is neutral. It could be used for good, and it could be used for bad. And whether it's the wheel, the fire, the computer, the internet, the airplane, they could be tools of destruction and death, or they could be used for good. So it is what it is, but it's the job of government to come along and say, here is the lanes you must operate in as business. And it's also the job of industry, I think, to say, here's what we should do that's right. Because every business is composed of people. And those people have families, and they have kids, and they should have a moral sense. And I think what we lost in the last 40 or 50 years is there used to be a moral sense among business leaders in the country, and we seem to have lost a little bit of the moral sense of business leaders. Sometimes it's just the shareholders. And I think we've ebbed at that, and now we're going in a different direction. And I think the direction is that you owe something to society. And the other thing is, if you don't take care of yourself, you will be regulated. So we represent all the people who make the devices that you wear and monitor your heart rate. Mine's 67. So we felt under the Obama administration they're about to regulate us. So that provoked us to get into a room with Google and Fitbit and Samsung and Apple and everyone else. And within 3 months, we created a standard which says this is how we'll regulate privacy. We'll voluntarily do it. We'll be clear language, what our policies are. We'll be transparent. We will not sell commercially without express permission. We'll allow anyone to opt out. And I haven't heard about a problem then with these devices. But some of the privacy issues we heard talking about earlier, they're very broad-brushed, like GDPR. Europe is so good with privacy. They have the right to be forgotten. They have GDPR. They want to regulate artificial intelligence now the same way. They want to do everything they can to regulate. The result has been for Europe, with all this over-regulation, frankly, is they have almost no innovation going on. There's some. I mean, France is great. They have several hundred companies, and they have a great leader who's focused on innovation. But generally, there's been only a handful of European unicorns, companies with a value over $1 billion. Young companies. Europe has several hundred. China has a couple of hundred. So how is it that China, which is bigger than Europe and North America combined in terms of people and probably land mass, is doing so well right now, and U.S. is doing well, but Europe isn't doing well? In my view, it comes down to, it's multifactorial. I mean, there are different languages are an issue, but it's regulation, over-regulation. And now we're entering an era where artificial intelligence is absolutely critical to economic and physical health. And the physical health we're going to see with artificial intelligence, we're going to have longer lives, we're going to have personalized medicine, we're going to have all sorts of things that are going to change how we live, work, and play, and how the entire world does, because it'll affect water, clean water, agriculture, healthcare, medicine, transportation, communication, education, and entertainment. And it's a global battle that's going on. And right now, mostly it's between North America, U.S. and Canada. Canada's doing pretty good, and China. And China is behind, but they have a better strategy than we have right now. They have no privacy. They have a huge amount of data. They have a national focus on AI. They have 1 million engineers a year they're graduating. Not all of them, some of them we would consider very minor technical skill engineers, but some of them are very sophisticated. And their business models to take whatever we've done really well and improve upon it with 1,000 companies competing against each other. So AI, they have a good strategy. The European strategy is not very good. It's, well, we think it's important, and we're going to regulate the heck out of it. That's their strategy. That's not going to work. It doesn't make me want to invest in Europe as much as I love Europe and Europeans. Because what we do share with Europe as a nation is a shared culture, a shared value of liberty and individual rights. The United States is like Goldilocks in the Three Bears right now. Our porridge is just the right temperature, but we're about on the precipice of adopting, as California has, the European privacy mechanism, which would pretty much stifle a lot of artificial intelligence. And everyone says they're really concerned about these big companies, and I represent all the big companies, and 80% of our membership is small companies. The truth is those big companies will deal with these regulations. The small companies, the new entrants, it's a huge barrier to entry. We're already seeing that with GDPR. We're seeing people have cut back, businesses who can't do things, a lot of disruption in a huge way. Because the truth is, what we have failed to do as an industry, and I have not convinced people of this a dozen years ago when I surfaced, is to set the privacy rules and the internet rules so instead of reading those lengthy things that no one's ever read, that you get a diamond, platinum, gold, silver standard, and you just click and you know what you're getting pretty much. So it's some third-party certification that everyone agrees upon. But one of the things is with artificial intelligence coming, which was a little bit of the topic I was asked to talk about, is jobs. And we could talk about all these things that are great with artificial intelligence, and absolutely they are. It's going to change lives. But we have to deal with, and we have to develop skills in one area that I've had worked on and am not there yet, and that is empathy. And that is an understanding that there's fear out there among people, which is natural, that they will lose their jobs. Now, the truth is in every technology that's come along, there's been concerns about that and jobs, at least in the modern era. And new jobs were created, but old jobs were lost. There's not a lot of blacksmiths anymore. There's not a lot of people who ride horses, at least in the developed world. People who make horse equipment, travel agents, bank tellers, things like that, although you could argue the other side of some of those, because the efficiency of those allowed the technology, which theoretically replaced those people, created new opportunities. And they certainly created new jobs, and there is disruption. There is that period of time. Now, with artificial intelligence, and especially self-driving cars, we're facing a situation where you have, by definition, the #1 occupation in the world of driving right now, at least a formal occupation. And that there's a lot of concern about a disruption there. But when you think about the disabled and the older people that will empower and the lives that will save 1 million globally a year, 35,000 in the US, if we just get 90% of the accidents removed, it's worth doing. So the question is, what do you do about all these people? And it's also in factories and it's less skilled. What do you do about them? How do you deal with it? And what can you do today? So with today, I think it's brighter than I would indicate. Because first of all, empathy. We are living longer. We have the lowest birth rate we've ever had. We're not allowing immigrants in, or we're reducing them dramatically in tone. We're clearly, that's the direction we're heading in on almost any scenario. So what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we have a lot of jobs for a while. There will be a recession in the next 1 to 3 or 4 years, because there is a business cycle. And then we'll free up some of the workers. Right now, we have several million jobs open. We can't, that's the #1 issue now for my 2,000 members, is hiring people. They're lowering their standards, they're getting rid of drug tests. We have a whole thing with veterans that we've financed to get veterans to work using their veterans classification. And we're trying everything we can, from the earliest kids, just supporting youth clubs in this area, to moving along to college, to supporting startups. We just announced our organization a $10 million fund to invest in women and minority-owned or led startups, because there's a lack, let's be honest, there's a lack of money going there, because people invest in people they're comfortable with, and 95% of the people making decisions are white men. So there's just underinvestment in populations which have great potential and are overlooked. To going on further, so what else can we do? Well, we just announced Ginny Rometty of IBM announced a partnership with us to focus on apprentices. So IBM has taken a program which is traditionally aimed at like plumbing or hand skills to brain skills. And they're doing it at IBM, and they've opened that up to any company that wants to do it. We already have 50 companies signed up. We just announced this in January. 50 major companies are interested in learning how IBM does it, how their apprenticeship program, where you go from high school, or maybe being in the military, or even, as they brought out on stage at our event in January, a dreamer. And you can get trained within a year and almost certainly get a job with a company that's training you. So you get skills without our crazy educational system, where we are promiscuously throwing huge amounts of money at kids that they don't even understand they're borrowing, and that they are then debt-ridden to pay back for being trained in things which don't have that much marketability right now, frankly. So what areas should kids be going to? You might be asking yourself that even as parents. Obviously, data analysis is absolutely huge. Having breakfast with the governor of Virginia this morning, there was a lot of discussion about what Virginia's doing in terms of redirecting our universities and even our high schools to try to teach things which are marketable, such as IT, software creation, various computer services, data analysis. Those are real jobs which will be open. Now, the problem is those are risky in a sense, because they change rapidly. It used to be used up to, creating websites was a big deal, but then all of a sudden hyperlinks came and services which created websites with templates, and it changes so quickly that you may be learning something which will be outdated in 3 or 4 years. But then the other side of the human equation jobs, because we'll be living longer, and because there's a shortage of immigrants, and because we need help and we're an aging population, who's going to take care of us? We will need people that have basic human skills, not only for help with the aging and disabled population, but also to help at the jobs that have human skills, which it'll be a long time before AI replaces it. And if you want to look at AI in a real big sense, and I don't want to scare you or depress you, the truth is AI may be our savior, because never before in the history of mankind have we had so many threats to our existence. We have global warming, We have potential war, a lot of nuclear powers. We have amazingly ability to quickly spread disease, and we're getting, I know we've cured some, but we're getting resilience to others. We're the only species capable of killing itself, and the history of all species on the Earth is that 95% of them have become extinct. So the odds are pretty overwhelming we're going to become extinct. So two things are happening in the artificial intelligence world which will help us. One is artificial intelligence, there's certain levels. Right now we're at the basic level, which is you could do one function. You could fly an airplane, you could drive a car, you could win at Go or chess, or run a factory thing that could identify different shapes and package them. But increasingly the goal is to replicate and then surpass the human mind. Once you've surpassed the human mind, there's a lot of ethical issues I'm happy to talk about afterwards. But the truth is, once you've replicated the human mind, then you could replicate a human mind. Any one of your minds can be replicated, any one of your brains. But there's still a physical structure which has to be replicated. How do you do that? Well, the advances in robotics are rather quick and fast, and you could soon replicate, not soon, but within the next 20, 30, 40 years, the human body for the most part. We're already seeing it. Some of you might have artificial parts in your bodies, but we're going there quickly. So when you get the body and the brain together, artificial intelligence, we may replicate ourselves, solve the problems of healthcare because we'll live forever, disappoint our great-grandchildren we'll never see. I mean, it raises a huge number of ethical issues. I don't know how many want to live forever, but the truth is that may save humankind going forward. So on that happy note, I don't have any idea where I am with time, if I've covered the subjects that you desired. Are we okay? Could I take a question or a response or not? And we have any? Yes, we have a... Oh, wait, is there a microphone? You know, I've been to places where they throw the microphone. Because you asked the first question, I will sign your book first. I usually let my staff have the first meal first in our all staff meetings.
Well, my name is Lilian Peraza from Venezuela and Mexico. And my question would be like, even though here in America, I have been living here for 6 years, it's amazing the innovation and everything that we can have. In Latin America, we don't have that. What do you think it would be the best way to connect? Because when you travel to a country that is so developed like this, and you're coming from Latin America, in this case, Venezuela is a very particular example, but Mexico is kind of more close. You don't have the access to many things in your country. And then when you travel, you are like far away from, from being part of the country or being part of the culture. So how do you deal with Latin America? You talk about Europe and China. That's
a great question. My view of that is, number one, doing what you're doing. Be here and go back and forth and cultural exchange to get the education, to spread the world, to have the skills, and to help foster business there. And frankly, U.S. policy helps that in one way, and that is we don't welcome foreign graduates to stay here. It's a dumb policy in ours, but it does benefit the rest of the world. I used to go to conferences where my colleagues from around the world would get angry at me in the U.S. because we were taking their best citizens and keeping them here and training them and giving them PhDs. We don't do it. We kick them out now. So our stupidity is your gain, but I think that encourages cultural exchange. The second is to figure out what you're really good at and tap that. I mean, Latin America is huge. I love Latin America because there is a sense of purpose there. There's a strong religious base, which I think is culturally binding and very positive. There's a great work ethic. I mean, when people say, this is where the administration gets me very upset, and the right wing is, I think immigrants that are here, especially illegally, are the hardest workers in the world. I don't know how, you'd be blind not to see that. And part of it is cultural, part of it is economic. But the bottom line of it is you figure out what you're good at, and I think you do it to the best of your ability, and you figure it out. Mexico kind of blew their advantage in oil, as did Venezuela. There was no good strategy there that stuck. There was the well there. In Venezuela, I think you should change your leadership, but that's just my opinion.
Let's take one more question, and then I think we'll...
Your call. You're the boss. Yeah. El Jefe. I saw a hand right there. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Greg Schuckman. Gary, I read Fast Company and Wired and Popular Mechanics and Fortune, and I feel like you're the living embodiment of what I read. This is fantastic.
Oh, so good. I'm glad you said that.
I was also the chair of
Could
Northern
be reading
Virginia.
it because you disagree with it.
No. I was also the chair of Northern Virginia Community College, so hopefully NOVA is at the MVTC.
I think I didn't mention that, but between community colleges are phenomenal, especially NOVA, actually.
Yeah. So the question I wanted to ask actually was, it came up about 1958. One of the other things that happened in 1958 was the passage of the National Defense Education Act. And that was what really sprinted us ahead in terms of the STEM workforce that led to all this innovation that we had in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s. Are we at a point now where government should be considering an NDA 2 to deal with all of the new STEM challenges that we have?
I don't think there's a silver bullet that the role of government, in my view, is to, number one, set the parameters for business to operate in a way that you know it's legal to start. So like in Europe now, they go after our best companies because they use very vague antitrust laws. And now you have the leading light of the Democratic Party saying that capitalism has totally failed. The newest member of Congress from New York, who was celebrating Amazon being kicked out of New York. So we have failed as our generation to educate our students on basics, since a lot of them, this is a view of a lot of the younger generation, that capitalism is a total failure. You know, to me, capitalism is the thing that's gotten more people out of poverty than anything else in the world. And it's just not innovation, it's also the free market system which encourages it. So in terms of, the reason I admire China's strategy is they're choosing the right technologies in a broad way. They're looking at AI and robotics and some of the other fields which are really obviously the future. And I talk about in my book, and I use the 2x2 that a famous general used, cabinet secretary, that said, you know, we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know, and that's what will hurt you as a business. It could hurt you as a country. It could hurt you in anything. And then there's the other two boxes which you could work around, and you shouldn't just assume. My point is that strategies are really important, but so is flexibility. I don't advocate for strategic planning in the corporate sense. I advocate for a one-page or a two-page document laying out your 5-year goals and then adjusting them along the way rather than tactical plans. So yeah, there's room to say we should be refocusing our educational system. Absolutely. And I can't help but resist include financial literacy and economic literacy as part of that. I'm not sure everyone has to be a scientist. I mean, I think a lot of people are smarter than I who could fix things. We need people who could fix things. We need to do what Germany has done, not only with apprenticeship programs, but to change the cultural attitude of the country. So in Germany, if you have a technical degree, you have equal status with somebody with a university degree. I don't know why university degrees are so great. I can't figure it out. You know, you could get, sorry if you're a major in art history, but an art history degree, and somehow you are better than someone who knows how to fix, you know, the equipment in my building. And that's craziness. And I think we have to change our culture. We have to have a cultural shift. And frankly, the safety valve for us for the last 30 or 40 years has been immigration. They're the ones who know how to fix stuff because they recognize it's a job that pays. And I don't know the demographics of Nova Community College, but I would say it's heavily immigrant, diverse community. And if we cut off that safety valve, nothing's going to work. We'll become like Venezuela is today soon. So I'm concerned about our direction. That's what I'm saying. The first role of government is not to screw it up. And we're on the verge of doing that. Our failure to invest in infrastructure, our failure to allow immigration, to invest in technical education. We are so vulnerable as a country in so many different ways. And we have new threats like cybersecurity was talked about earlier. So we need a national strategy that makes sense rather than, I mean, if you listen to some of the debates like about walls and things, it's not that one side is wrong or right. They're both right and they're both wrong. But they're not relevant to the problems our kids are going to face, because our kids are going to face a massive debt load that will suck every penny out of the economy. Interest rates go up a couple points, and we're spending $1 trillion a year just on interest payments. Much less forget about national defense. That's why our defense leaders have said this is the biggest threat to the national defense is our deficit. So, and our debt, which is the accumulation of every deficit. So where are we in terms of education? I think we need a radical change to our educational system. It occurred to me this morning, listening to the governor of Virginia. You know, any state could do this. They could stand up there and say, this is what every citizen of our state shall have to know to get either a high school degree or to move along. There's basic things I think we need to know as human beings. I mean, you know, some things, then there's the old side of me. I'll go just one sec. Like, my kids are not learning cursive writing, or some kids aren't. And like, oh, that's really bad. On the other hand, to get them to learn Chinese in their school district is almost impossible. I'll tell you where I think my wife and I, my kids are 6 and 10 years old. They are fluent, like native speakers in Mandarin and Polish, because my wife immigrated from Poland, and that's the primary language spoken in the house. The second language is Chinese, because since the kids were born, we've had Chinese au pairs living with us that only speak Chinese to our kids. That's why they're there. So it's not that I fear that, because I don't want them beholden to their Chinese masters someday, long after I'm gone. But my wife won that discussion. So thank you very much.
We do have free books outside of Gary's book, so Gary's kindly offered to stay and sign as many as he has time to sign. So if you guys queue up outside, I think we have books for everyone. So thank you for coming.